Welcome to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight, we leave behind sunlit gardens and fairy tale kingdoms and step quietly into a different kind of story. Not a tale of monsters, not a tale of danger, but an old Victorian ghost story, the kind once shared beside lamplight on warm evenings when the windows stood open to the night air. Tonight's story is called The Empty House, inspired by the classic tale by Algernon Blackwood. So settle beneath your blankets, let your breathing grow slow and easy, and together we'll pay a gentle visit to a house that has been waiting patiently in the moonlight for many years. There are certain houses that seem to reveal their nature at once, just as there are certain people who enter a room smiling pleasantly and speaking kindly, yet somehow leave behind a feeling of unease that cannot easily be explained. So too, there are houses that possess a character all their own. One may search in vain for reason. The windows appear ordinary. The doors are no different from any others. The garden is neatly tended. The paint is sound. And yet, something about the place causes the eye to linger and the heart to grow cautious. Such houses seem to carry memories within their walls, long after the footsteps that once crossed their floors have faded into silence, long after the voices that once filled their rooms have vanished. Something remains, a feeling, an atmosphere, a lingering impression that refuses to depart. Now, whether this comes from imagination or from something deeper, few can say, yet most people have known such places. A room entered reluctantly, a path avoided without reason, a house passed quickly, even in daylight. The house that stood in the square of this quiet seafront town was one such place. Curiously, there was nothing remarkable about it. It stood shoulder to shoulder with its neighbors. Its windows matched theirs. Its narrow strip of garden matched theirs. Its chimney pots rose at much the same height, and its balcony overlooked the square just as the others did. To a stranger passing down through town, it would have appeared entirely ordinary. Yet, no one who lived nearby considered it ordinary. Stories clung to it. Families came and went. Tenants arrived hopeful and departed hurriedly. Servants refused to remain. Even those who knew nothing of its reputation often reported an inexplicable discomfort after crossing its threshold. No one could properly explain why. They simply knew. And in a town where people generally preferred practical explanations, that knowledge alone was unsettling enough. Fortunately for the house, or perhaps unfortunately, there lived in the town a woman who possessed a lifelong fascination with mysteries. Her name was Julia. To most of the town, she was simply Miss Julia, a familiar and well-loved figure along the seafront, known for her lively mind, her independent spirit, and her endless curiosity about unusual happenings. She lived in a small cottage overlooking the sea. The cottage stood near the far end of the promenade, where the town gradually surrendered itself to the open shoreline. From her front window, she could watch the tides rolling in and out across the green-gray water. She knew the cries of the gulls. She knew the sound of the fishing boats returning at dusk. And she knew how the fog drifted inland on autumn evenings and wrapped itself around the harbor like a soft gray blanket. And she knew perhaps better than anyone in town every strange story that had ever been whispered along the coast. For many years she had maintained a keen interest in mysteries that other people preferred to avoid discussing. Tales of unexplained happenings, curious local legends, and accounts of unusual experiences fascinated her. Most people treated such stories as little more than entertainment. Miss Julia, however, took them rather seriously. Not foolishly, and certainly not recklessly, but with the sincere conviction that there were still many things in the world that had yet to be properly understood. And on a warm autumn afternoon, she had sent a telegram to her nephew, Mr. Shorthouse. The message had been brief, urgent, and entirely mysterious. As a result, Mr. Shorthouse arrived that very evening expecting almost anything. What he found instead was his aunt waiting at the door with an excitement she could scarcely contain. The moment he stepped inside and kissed her wrinkled cheek in greeting, he sensed at once that something unusual was afoot. Her eyes sparkled. Her hands seemed incapable of remaining still. Even during tea, she appeared distracted by thoughts she was struggling not to reveal. Mr. Shorthouse observed all this with increasing suspicion. He had known his aunt all his life. He recognized the signs. Whenever Aunt Julia became this excited, an adventure was never far away. After tea, they left the cottage and walked slowly along the seafront. Dusk had begun to settle over the town. The last traces of daylight lingered along the western horizon, while the sea darkened into silver and slate. Gentle waves rolled against the shore. Far out upon the water, a lantern glimmered briefly before disappearing behind a veil of gathering mist. The promenade was nearly empty now. A few townsfolk lingered near the railings watching the tide. Gas lamps had begun to glow softly through the evening haze. Their golden reflections trembled upon the damp paving stones. For several minutes, Aunt Julia remained unusually silent. Mr. Shorthouse waited patiently. Experience had taught him that she enjoyed dramatic revelations. At last she moved a little closer and lowered her voice. "I've got the keys," she announced. The delight in her tone was impossible to miss. "Got them until Monday." Mr. Shorthouse glanced at her. "The keys to what?" She smiled. "The bathing machine, perhaps?" he suggested. Nothing delighted Aunt Julia more than pretending not to understand her. Her eyes narrowed immediately. "Don't be ridiculous." "Then what? What keys have you acquired?" She looked toward the darkening sea, then back to him, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped almost to a whisper. "The keys to the haunted house in the square." She paused just long enough for the words to settle between them. Then her smile widened. "And I'm going there tonight." For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The waves continued their steady rhythm against the shore, washing softly against the stones below the promenade. Farther out, beyond the reach of the lamps, the sea stretched into gathering darkness. A few fishing boats still lingered upon the water, their lanterns glowing faintly throughout the mist. Mr. Shorthouse walked beside his aunt, considering her announcement. The keys of the haunted house. Spoken aloud, the words sounded faintly absurd, and yet Aunt Julia's expression left no room for doubt. She was entirely serious. At last he smiled. "You mean to say that after all these years, you've actually managed to obtain permission to enter the place?" "I have." "And the owner agreed?" "He lives in London now," said Aunt Julia. "He was only too pleased to lend them to me." Mr. Shorthouse laughed. "That seems remarkably trusting." "Not at all." Her eyes sparkled. "He knows perfectly well that I've been trying to gain access for years." "And now you've succeeded." "And now I've succeeded." The satisfaction in her voice was unmistakable. Mr. Shorthouse shook his head. "You've been planning this for some time." Naturally, they continued walking. The evening mist drifted slowly inland from the sea, wrapping itself around the lamps and the softening edges of the town. Behind them, the harbor light shimmered faintly through the haze. "You know," said Mr. Shorthouse after a while, "I've heard stories." "So have I." "Most of them are probably nonsense." "Perhaps." The answer surprised him. Aunt Julia rarely surrendered an argument so easily. "You don't sound convinced." "I am not convinced of anything," she replied. "That is precisely why I wish to visit the house." The remark pleased him. It sounded exactly like her. Aunt Julia possessed a genuine interest in unusual phenomenon, but she was not foolishly credulous. She preferred investigation to speculation, questions to assumptions, facts to rumors. Unfortunately, the house in the square offered very few facts. Rumors, however, were abundant. The building had stood empty for years. Families arrived and departed. Servants refused to remain. Tenants abandoned their leases. And visitors complained of strange feelings. And gradually, the stories accumulated. Each generation seemed to add another layer to the mystery. The townspeople spoke of the house reluctantly. Even those who laughed at ghost stories often crossed the square on the opposite side, whenever possible. "Do you know how the reputation began?" Aunt Julia asked quietly. "Well, I've heard several versions." "So have I." For a few moments she watched the dark water beyond the promenade rail. The stories all seemed to begin with a woman. Mr. Shorthouse waited. "A woman who once lived there." "What happened to her?" Aunt Julia shook her head. "No one appears to know certainty. Only that something dreadful occurred." "And afterward?" "Afterward," she said softly, "the house was never quite the same." The breeze stirred the edge of her shawl. For a while neither of them spoke. The mist thickened slightly around the lamps, turning their glow pale and diffuse. At length Mr. Shorthouse shrugged. "Stories grow in the telling." "They do." "And tragedy does not necessarily create a haunting." "No." A faint smile touched Aunt Julia's lips. "But it often creates a mystery." That answer, more than any mention of ghosts, told him she had already made up her mind. Nothing was going to prevent this expedition. Not reason, not caution, and certainly not her nephew. He sighed. "I suppose there's no attempting to dissuade you?" "None whatsoever." "I feared as much." Aunt Julia slipped her arm through his. "Then you'll come?" Mr. Shorthouse looked out across the dark water. The last traces of evening had vanished now, leaving only the distant lights of the harbor and the soft, rhythmic sound of the waves below. Unexpectedly, he found himself curious. Not about ghosts, not even about hauntings, but about the house itself. The empty rooms, the years of silence, the mystery that had endured long after ordinary explanations had faded. At length he nodded. "Very well." Aunt Julia's face brightened at once. "We shall go together." For several moments they walked on in a companionable silence. Then Aunt Julia spoke again. "There's only one thing." Mr. Shorthouse glanced at her. "What is it?" "If anything unpleasant should happen." The seriousness in her voice surprised him. She continued looking ahead as she spoke. "I don't imagine it will, of course. Still, if it should." She hesitated. "Well?" Aunt Julia smiled faintly. You mustn't leave me." Mr. Shorthouse laughed. "I had no intention of doing so. I mean it." She turned towards him. "If anything happens in that house, promise you'll stay beside me." The request was so unlike her usual confident manner that he answered her at once. "Of course I will." "Good." She seemed satisfied. Then after a moment, her cheerful expression returned. "There now," she said. "That's settled." And together they turned away from the seafront and began walking toward the square, toward number 13, toward the house that had stood empty for so many years. The walk from the seafront to the square seemed shorter than either of them expected. Perhaps it was because Aunt Julia's thoughts had already arrived at their destination. Or perhaps it was because the house itself occupied so much of their imagination that the intervening streets passed almost unnoticed. The town had grown quiet. Most of the shops were closed now, and the few people still abroad appeared eager to reach home before the evening fog settled more heavily over the streets. The harbor lay behind them, hidden by rows of houses and narrow lanes, yet the scent of salt still lingered in the air, carried inland by a gentle breeze from the sea. Mr. Shorthouse noticed that his aunt's earlier excitement had changed somewhat during the walk. She remained eager, certainly, but there was now a seriousness about her that had not been present before. More than once he caught her looking ahead, as though she expected the house to appear around the next corner. At last, they entered the square. An enclosed garden occupied its center, behind iron railings darkened by years of sea air. Lamps glowed softly through the mist, illuminating the paths and shrubs within. Around the garden stood rows of houses, their windows warm with lamplight and the quiet occupations of evening. Yet, almost immediately, Mr. Shorthouse's attention settled upon one particular house. No one pointed it out. No sign distinguished it from its neighbors. And still, he knew. "There it is," he said quietly. Aunt Julia followed his gaze. Yes, number 13 stood among the others exactly as it always had. Its frontage was no different from theirs. It possessed the same narrow garden, the same steps leading to the front door, and the same arrangement of windows overlooking the square. Viewed objectively, there was little about the building that ought to have inspired uneasiness. Yet, it seemed somehow detached from life surrounding it. The neighboring houses appeared inhabited even from a distance. Their windows glowed warmly, and now and then, the shadow of a passing figure crossed a curtain. Number 13 offered no such impression. Its windows reflected the lamplight without revealing anything of the rooms beyond, and its dark facade seemed withdrawn from the ordinary life of the square. Mr. Shorthouse found himself staring at it longer than he intended. Without knowing why, he felt reluctant to approach it. For a few moments, neither spoke. The house stood silent beneath the mist, showing no sign that it had noticed their arrival. Then Aunt Julia reached into her handbag and withdrew the key. The sight of it transformed the evening. Until that moment, their expedition had retained something of the quality of a story. They had discussed the house, speculated about its reputation, and amused themselves with the prospect of exploration. The key changed all that. It reminded Mr. Shorthouse that within a matter of minutes they would be standing inside the very house that generations of townspeople had preferred to avoid. Aunt Julia opened the gate. Together they crossed the short path leading to the front door. The garden showed signs of neglect, though not enough to suggest complete abandonment. A few hardy plants still clung to life along the borders, and weeds had begun to claim portions of the pathway. Mr. Shorthouse found himself remembering the promise he had made during their walk. "You mustn't leave me." The words returned unexpectedly. He glanced at his aunt and saw that, despite her composure, she held the lantern a little more tightly than before. The key entered the lock, and for a moment, neither moved. Then Aunt Julia turned it. The mechanism responded with a heavy click that seemed unusually loud in the stillness of the square. The door swung inward. A faint breath of stale air drifted out to meet them. It carried the unmistakable scent of a house that had stood closed for many years. Aunt Julia raised her lantern. Its glow revealed a narrow hallway just beyond the threshold. The wallpaper had faded with age. A fine layer of dust softened the woodwork. And at the far end of the staircase, disappeared into darkness. Nothing about the scene was remarkable, and yet Mr. Shorthouse experienced at once the curious sensation that he had crossed an invisible boundary. The square remained only a few yards behind him. The lamps still burned, the neighboring houses remained occupied, and ordinary life continued all around them. Yet it already seemed strangely distant, as though the threshold they had crossed marked a greater separation than the few steps between the front door and the street. Together, they stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath their weight, and when Aunt Julia closed the door behind them, the sound echoed faintly through the empty house. For several moments, they stood listening. The silence within the building possessed a quality unlike the silence of the sleeping town outside. It seemed attentive somehow, as though the house itself were aware of their presence. Then, from somewhere beyond the reach of the lantern light, there came the unmistakable sound of a cough. And Julia stopped so suddenly that Mr. Shorthouse halted beside her. Neither spoke. The sound had been perfectly ordinary, yet in a house that was supposed to be empty, it seemed to alter everything. For several moments, neither of them moved. The sound of the cough seemed to linger in the darkness long after it faded. Aunt Julia held the lantern a little higher. Mr. Shorthouse listened carefully, hoping to hear some ordinary explanation. Another cough, perhaps. The movement of a servant unexpectedly left behind by the owner. Even the sound of a stray animal would have been welcome. Nothing followed. The silence returned exactly as before. At last, Aunt Julia released a slow breath. "Well," she said quietly, "someone appears to have arrived before us." Her attempt at lightness did not entirely succeed. Mr. Shorthouse smiled. "If so, they have chosen an odd place to spend the evening." Encouraged by the sound of his own voice, he stepped farther into the hallway. The beam of the lantern traveled across the walls and over several closed doors. Dust lay everywhere, not thickly enough to suggest neglect extending over decades, but sufficiently to indicate that no one had occupied the house for a very long time. The air possessed that peculiar stillness common to abandoned buildings. Nothing stirred, nothing creaked, nothing suggested recent human presence. And yet the cough remained difficult to explain. "Shall we begin?" asked Aunt Julia. Since neither wished to remain standing in the hallway indefinitely, they agreed that a systematic examination of the lower floor would be the most sensible course. Mr. Shorthouse opened the door first. The room beyond proved to be a dining room. The furniture remained in place beneath white dust sheets that transformed familiar objects into strange and unfamiliar shapes. The lantern light cast long shadows across the covered chairs and table, giving the impression that silent guests had gathered there years earlier and never departed. Aunt Julia walked slowly around the room. "It feels untouched," "It probably is." "No," she replied after a moment. "I mean something else." Mr. Shorthouse looked at her. She was studying the room with unusual concentration. "It feels," she said carefully, "as though people left in a hurry." The observation unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He couldn't have explained why, yet the thought seemed oddly appropriate. Not because there was evidence of haste. There was not. Rather, because the room possessed an atmosphere of interruption, as though ordinary life had once existed here, and then stopped abruptly, without warning, without conclusion. They examined the remainder of the room and found nothing unusual. The second room proved equally unremarkable. It appeared to have served as a sitting room or a drawing room. Books still occupied several shelves. A cracked mirror hung above the fireplace. A clock stood upon the mantelpiece with its hands permanently fixed at the hour long forgotten. Mr. Shorthouse found himself glancing repeatedly toward the doorway. Not because he expected to see anything. Quite the opposite. He expected to see nothing. Yet, he could not shake the persistent impression that someone might be standing just beyond the reach of the lantern light. Watching, waiting, listening. The feeling was irrational. He knew that. Nevertheless, it remained. And as they moved from room to room, the sensation gradually strengthened. The house revealed nothing. No voices, no footsteps, no apparitions. Yet its silence seemed increasingly purposeful. It was no longer merely the absence of sound. It felt more like presence. An invisible attention directed steadily toward the two intruders who wandered through its rooms. By the time they returned to the hallway, even Aunt Julia appeared less eager than before. The excitement that had accompanied their arrival had given way to something quieter, something more thoughtful. She looked up at the staircase, disappearing into the darkness above. Then she looked back at her nephew. "Do you still wish to continue?" she asked. Mr. Shorthouse followed her gaze. The upper floor waited silently above them. "More than ever," he replied. Then together, they turned toward the rear of the house, where a narrow passage led toward the kitchen and the servants' quarters beyond. The narrow passage beyond the hallway led them toward the rear of the house. The rooms they had already examined had revealed nothing beyond dust, silence, and an atmosphere that neither of them found easy to explain. Yet, instead of diminishing, the uneasy feeling seemed to strengthen as they moved deeper into the building. Mr. Shorthouse could not have said precisely when they became aware of it. The sensation arrived gradually. At first, it resembled nothing more than discomfort. Then, it became a feeling of watchfulness. And finally, it settled into the persistent impression that the house itself had disapproved of their presence. The thought was absurd. He knew it. Houses possessed neither thoughts nor opinions. Yet, the feeling remained. The passage ended at the door leading into the kitchen. Aunt Julia held the lantern higher as they entered. The room was large and unexpectedly ordinary. Pots still hung from hooks upon the walls. Shelves remained fixed in place, and a long wooden table occupied the center of the room. Everything appeared exactly as one might expect. Only the dust revealed how much time had passed since the room had last been used. "Nothing remarkable here," said Mr. Shorthouse. "No," Aunt Julia agreed. Yet, her voice suggested that she was listening for something. Or perhaps, expecting something. They crossed the kitchen and entered the scullery beyond. The air felt cooler there. The small window looked out into the darkness. Mr. Shorthouse found himself glancing repeatedly toward it, though he could not have explained why. The lantern light seemed unusually weak, not dimmer than before, merely less effective. The shadows appeared reluctant to retreat. Aunt Julia said nothing, and neither did he. The silence between them had changed since entering the house. Earlier it had been comfortable. Now it felt attentive, as though both were listening for sounds they hoped not to hear. They returned to the passage. The lantern threw a wavering circle of light ahead of them. Beyond it, darkness filled the remainder of the corridor. Mr. Shorthouse had just opened his mouth to suggest returning to the main hall when Aunt Julia suddenly caught his arm. He felt her fingers tighten. "What is it?" She didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she pointed. For a moment he saw nothing. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness ahead. A woman. She moved quickly along the passage, her head lowered as though avoiding pursuit. The sight lasted only an instant, yet it impressed itself upon Mr. Shorthouse's memory with extraordinary clarity. The woman appeared neither old nor young. Her clothing belonged to another time. One hand seemed pressed against her breast, while the other reached blindly toward the wall for support. Most striking of all was the expression upon her face. It wasn't anger, not surprise, not even sorrow. It was fear, a fear so profound that it seemed to have consumed every other emotion. The figure passed before them, then disappeared. Not by turning a corner, not by opening a door. It simply ceased to be there. The passage stood empty once more. For several seconds neither spoke. Mr. Shorthouse stared into the darkness where the woman had been. At last he turned towards Aunt Julia. "You saw her?" "Yes." Her voice was a little more than a whisper. "So it wasn't imagination?" "No." The answer brought him surprisingly little comfort. Together they remained where they stood, listening. The house had become silent again, yet the brief appearance of the woman seemed to have altered something. The oppressive atmosphere remained. But now, another feeling accompanied it, a feeling of urgency, as though somewhere within the walls of the house an unfinished story was struggling to make itself known. Aunt Julia drew a slow breath. Then she looked toward the staircase, visible at the far end of the hallway. The upper floors waited in darkness, and for reasons neither could have explained, both knew that whatever secrets the house still possessed were waiting above. For several moments, neither of them moved. The passage had returned to silence, yet the appearance of the woman lingered in their thoughts with extraordinary vividness. Mr. Shorthouse found it impossible to dismiss what he had witnessed. Had he been alone, he might eventually have persuaded himself that fatigue, expectation, or the uncertain light of the lantern had deceived him. But Aunt Julia had seen her as well. The figure had been real, or at least real enough to be shared. That certainty left him with a curious mixture of satisfaction and unease. The mystery they had come seeking unquestionably existed. Unfortunately, its reality proved far less comforting than its absence would have been. Neither spoke of turning back. The possibility never arose. The appearance of the woman had not diminished their curiosity. It had deepened it. Quietly, they retraced their steps through the kitchen and returned to the main hall. The staircase awaited them. Seen from a distance, it appeared perfectly ordinary. Its banister curved gracefully upward. Its steps showed the wear of many years. The landing above disappeared into shadow beyond the reach of the lantern. Nothing about it should have inspired alarm. Yet, the moment Mr. Shorthouse looked at it, he experienced an unmistakable reluctance to approach. The feeling arrived suddenly and without warning, A moment earlier he had been perfectly willing to continue. Now, he found himself wishing to remain exactly where he stood. The sensation was so unexpected that it irritated him. He took several steps forward. The feeling strengthened. Beside him, Aunt Julia had become unusually quiet. He glanced at her. She was staring upward. "What is it?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "I was wondering if you felt it too." Mr. Shorthouse did not immediately reply. There seemed little point pretending otherwise. "Perhaps." Aunt Julia nodded slowly. "I thought so." The lantern trembled slightly in her hand. Not from fear exactly, rather from the effort of resisting it. Neither could explain what troubled them. The staircase remained merely a staircase. No sound came from above, no movement disturbed the shadows. Yet both experienced the same powerful conviction that they were approaching the true center of whatever evil inhabited this house. For a long moment, they stood listening. The silence remained absolute. At length, Mr. Shorthouse straightened his shoulders. "We didn't come all this way to stare at it." Aunt Julia laughed softly. The sound relieved them both. "No," she agreed. "We did not." Together they approached the first step. The house seemed to grow quieter still. Mr. Shorthouse would later find it difficult to explain what happened next. Nothing visible changed, nothing moved, and yet as they began climbing, an extraordinary oppression descended upon them. It felt almost physical. The air itself seemed heavier. Their footsteps slowed. Conversation became impossible. Every instinct urged them to retreat. Mr. Shorthouse had never experienced anything quite like it. He knew that the sensation originated nowhere except within his own mind. Yet, that knowledge did nothing to weaken its power. Step by step, they continued upward. The lantern cast uncertain shadows upon the walls. Their movements seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Halfway to the landing, Aunt Julia stopped. Mr. Shorthouse turned immediately. She had gone pale. "Are you all right?" "Yes." The answer came too quickly. She attempted a smile. "I shall be fine." Yet her voice lacked conviction. Mr. Shorthouse remembered her request beside the sea. "You mustn't leave me." Without speaking, he moved slightly closer. The gesture appeared to reassure her. And after a moment she nodded. Together, they resumed the climb. When at last they reached the landing, both paused. A corridor stretched before them. Several doors closed along either side. The air felt colder there. Not dramatically colder, merely enough to notice. Mr. Shorthouse raised the lantern. Its light reached only a short distance into the passage before being swallowed by darkness. As he stood there listening, a curious thought entered his mind. The woman that they saw below had not been fleeing from the lower floor. She had been fleeing from somewhere above. The realization settled heavily upon him. For the first time that night, he found himself wondering not what they might discover in the house, but what might be waiting for them. At the far end of the corridor, one of the doors began to move. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though someone on the other side had placed a hand upon it and was beginning to open it. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The door at the far end of the corridor continued its slow movement until it stood partially open. Then it stopped. Nothing emerged. No sound followed. The corridor remained silent. Mr. Shorthouse stared at the doorway. Reason immediately supplied several explanations. a loose latch, a warped hinge, a current of air moving through the house. Any of them might have caused the door to open. Yet, none of those explanations seemed entirely satisfactory. Not because they were impossible, because they felt incomplete. Beside him, Aunt Julia said nothing. The lantern light trembled faintly upon the walls. Mr. Shorthouse took a step forward. Nothing happened. Another step. Still nothing. The oppressive atmosphere remained. Yet, curiosity gradually overcame hesitation. Together, they proceeded down the corridor. The door that had opened proved to be a small bedroom. Like the rooms below, it appeared abandoned rather than ruined. Dust covered the furniture. The curtains hung motionless. A washstand stood in one corner beside a narrow bed. Nothing distinguished the room from countless others. Yet, neither lingered there. The same proved true of the next room, and the next. Each appeared ordinary. Each seemed entirely empty. Yet as they continued their examination, the feeling of oppression increased steadily. Mr. Shorthouse became aware that he was speaking less and listening more. Listening for footsteps, listening for voices, listening for any sound that might explain the growing conviction that something unseen accompanied them through the house. Aunt Julia appeared similarly affected. Her earlier enthusiasm had nearly vanished, not because her courage had failed, rather because the house demanded concentration. Every room seemed to contain an invisible pressure that required constant resistance. At length, they reached the servants' quarters. The corridor narrowed there, and the ceiling sloped slightly beneath the roofline. The air felt close and strangely oppressive. Aunt Julia paused. "I dislike this part of the house." The admission surprised him. "So do I." For the first time that evening, neither attempted to laugh. The feeling had become too pronounced. It was no longer a matter of imagination, or at least it didn't feel like one. Mr. Shorthouse raised the lantern. The passage ahead remained empty, yet the sensation of being watched had become almost unbearable. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the darkness, from the very air surrounding them. They continued nonetheless, step by step, room by room. Eventually they entered a chamber at the end of the corridor. The room contained little beyond a chair, a small table, and a fireplace long cold. Aunt Julia set the lantern upon the table. For several moments both stood silently. The effort of maintaining their composure had become exhausting. Mr. Shorthouse found himself wishing, quite suddenly, that they had never entered the house at all. The thought startled him. He was not ordinarily a nervous man, yet something within this building seemed determined to undermine every reserve of confidence he possessed. Aunt Julia moved closer. Without speaking, she slipped her arm through his. The gesture reminded him of her request beside the sea. "You mustn't leave me." He patted her hand reassuredly. "Will not remain much longer." "No," she replied quietly. "I think we've seen enough." The words had scarcely left her lips when it happened. Mr. Shorthouse would remember the moment for the rest of his life. A movement appeared near the doorway. Not a sound, not a shadow, a movement. Instinctively he turned. Something stood just beyond the threshold. For the briefest instant he perceived a face. It seemed suspended in the darkness where no face should have been. The features appeared distorted by an expression of such concentrated malice that he could scarcely comprehend it. Hatred, cruelty, a desire for harm so intense that it seemed almost tangible. The impression lasted no more than a second, yet its effect was overwhelming. At that exact instant, the lantern flame wavered violently, then went out. Darkness rushed upon them, complete, absolute, and from somewhere within the darkness, came Aunt Julia's sharp intake of breath. For several moments, neither of them moved. The darkness that followed the extinction of the lantern seemed almost physical. Mr. Shorthouse remained exactly where he stood, aware only of Aunt Julia beside him and the violent beating of his own heart. Neither spoke. There was no need. He knew with complete certainty that she had seen it, just as she knew he had. He found the matches. The small flame trembled as he relit the lantern. A circle of light returned reluctantly to the room. The doorway stood empty. Nothing waited there. Nothing moved. The face had vanished as completely as though it had never existed. Yet, its memory remained. Mr. Shorthouse doubted that either of them would ever forget it. Aunt Julia looked pale. He suspected. He looked much the same. For several seconds they regarded one another in silence. Then she drew a slow breath. "Well," she said quietly, "that was unfortunate." The remark was so characteristic of her that he almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he found himself oddly reassured. As long as Aunt Julia remained capable of such observations, perhaps matters had not yet become entirely hopeless. "You saw it?" he asked. "Yes." "So did I." Neither elaborated. Words seemed unequal to the task. Together they left the room. The corridor beyond appeared unchanged, yet the atmosphere had altered. The oppressive feeling they had experienced earlier no longer seemed vague or uncertain. It had acquired purpose. The house no longer felt merely unpleasant. It felt hostile, as though some intelligence within the building had become aware of them and objected to their presence. The realization should have encouraged them to leave. Instead, it produced a curious determination. Mr. Shorthouse later struggled to explain this. The sensible course would have been to immediate departure. Yet, neither proposed it. Having come so far, both felt compelled to see the matter through. The upper landing stretched before them in silence. The lantern light reached only a short distance ahead. Beyond it, shadows gathered in doorways and corners. The house seemed to be listening. Then Aunt Julia stopped. Her hand closed suddenly around his arm. "There," she whispered. At first he saw nothing. Then movement appeared at the far end of the corridor. A figure emerged from the darkness. The woman. There could be no doubt. She looked exactly as she had below. One hand pressed against her breast, fear written upon every feature, yet now her terror appeared even greater than before. She seemed desperate, driven, as though every instinct urged her forward. The figure hurried toward them, not looking at them, not aware of them, running past them. Mr. Shorthouse felt the air grow colder as she passed. Then she was gone. Not vanished. Gone forward. Toward the staircase. Toward something waiting beyond their sight. For an instant, neither moved. Then another sensation swept through the corridor unlike anything that they had yet experienced. It came not as a sight or a sound, but as an overwhelming impression. Mr. Shorthouse became suddenly aware of a presence filled with such concentrated malice that he felt physically ill. Hatred, cruelty, and violence seemed to pour through the passage in pursuit of the fleeing woman, filling the house with an emotional intensity that scarcely felt human. Aunt Julia tightened her grip upon his arm. Neither could see what followed, yet both knew with dreadful certainty that something had passed them. Something unseen. Something pursuing. The sensation moved toward the staircase and after the woman who had hurried by them only moments before. Then they became aware of the movement somewhere beyond the limits of their sight. The sounds were faint at first, little more than hurried footsteps echoing through the distant portion of the house. Yet, The impression of pursuit grew stronger with every passing second, until it seemed impossible to doubt what was unfolding before them. The woman was fleeing, and something was following her. Mr. Shorthouse gripped the lantern more tightly. Every instinct urged him to retreat, yet he remained where he stood beside Aunt Julia, listening to the invisible drama unfolding beyond the reach of the light. Then, a scream rang out throughout the house. It was unmistakably the voice of a woman, and it carried such terror that both Aunt Julia and Mr. Shorthouse stood frozen where they were. The sound echoed along the corridor, rushed down the staircase, and seemed to linger among the empty rooms long after it had ceased. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence that followed felt even more dreadful than the scream itself. Somewhere within the walls of the house, they felt certain that they had just witnessed the lingering memory of a terrible event. Yet whether that event belonged to the distant past or continued in some mysterious fashion, even now, neither could say. The house offered no explanation. It merely returned to silence. For several moments, neither of them moved. The scream had faded. The echoes had faded. Even the oppressive sensation that had swept through the house seemed to have withdrawn once more into silence. Yet neither Aunt Julia nor Mr. Shorthouse doubted what they had experienced. The house had shown them something. Whether it had been a memory, a haunting, or some lingering impression left behind by a terrible event, neither could say. But the mystery that they had come seeking was no longer a matter of speculation. It was real. The lantern burned steadily in Mr. Shorthouse's hand. Its small flame seemed reassuring now. A simple, ordinary light. A reminder that there remain sensible things in the world. For the first time that evening, he found himself with little desire to continue the investigation. And he looked at Aunt Julia. She was still pale. Yet, her composure had returned. "Well," he asked. For a moment she considered the question. Then a faint smile appeared. "I think," she said, "that we have learned quite enough for one night." Mr. Shorthouse could not have agreed more. Without further discussion, they began making their way toward the staircase. The house seemed strangely quiet now. Not welcoming, not peaceful. Simply watchful, as though it had revealed precisely as much as it intended to reveal. No more, no less. The descent felt considerably shorter than the climb had been. Perhaps because both were eager to leave, perhaps because the house no longer needed to oppose them. Mr. Shorthouse could not decide. The hallway appeared exactly as they had left it. The front door remained closed. The familiar shape of it filled him with an unexpected gratitude. Aunt Julia gave a small sigh of relief when she saw it. Together, they crossed the hall. Neither looked back. Mr. Shorthouse reached for the handle. The door opened. Cool night air rushed in at once. Fresh, clean, alive. Both paused upon the threshold. The contrast was remarkable. Only a few feet separated the house from the square outside, yet it felt as though they had crossed from one world into another. Beyond them lay silence, darkness, and the lingering memory of fear. Before them lay mist, lamplight, and the ordinary life of the town. They stepped outside. The door closed behind them with a quiet sound. Neither spoke until they had reached the center of the square. There, they stopped and turned. Number 13 stood exactly as before. Its windows remained dark. Its facade revealed nothing. No sign betrayed the strange drama that had unfolded within. It appeared once again to be merely an empty house among many others. Yet, both knew better. At length Aunt Julia slipped her arm through her nephew's. "Well," she said, "at least we can no longer complain of having insufficient evidence." Mr. Shorthouse laughed. The sound surprised him. It felt wonderfully ordinary. "I suppose not." They left the square behind them and made their way through the sleepy town. The streets seemed friendlier now. The lamps glowed more warmly. Even the mist appeared less oppressive. As they approached the seafront, the familiar scent of salt reached them once again. A gentle breeze drifted in from the water. Ahead, the dark sea stretched toward the horizon, beneath a sky filled with stars. Both stopped for a moment beside the promenade rail. Neither felt any great desire to speak. Some experiences seemed better left undisturbed. The waves rolled steadily against the shore below. A distant lantern moved slowly across the water. The town behind them had grown almost entirely silent. At length, Aunt Julia drew in a deep breath of cool night air. "Ah, it's good to be outside again." "It is." For a while they stood listening to the sea. The house in the square remained behind them. Its secrets remained behind it. And though neither would ever entirely forget what they had witnessed there, both felt content to leave the mystery where it belonged. Some stories demand explanation. Others seem destined to remain unfinished. Perhaps that was why the house retained its power. Not because it revealed its secrets, but because it guarded them. The sea breeze stirred gently around them. The waves continued their endless journey toward the shore. And beneath the quiet stars of that autumn night, Aunt Julia and Mr. Shorthouse turned at last toward home, leaving the house to its silence and its memories forever. And now, the house grows distant. The square is quiet once more. The lamps glow softly through the mist, and beyond the town, the sea continues its endless conversation with the shore. The tide rises. The tide falls. A lantern drifts slowly across the dark water. The waves whisper against the rocks below. And somewhere, far behind us, number 13 keeps its secrets. But we need not carry them any farther tonight. Instead, let your thoughts drift off across the moonlit sea. Let the cool, salt air wash away the shadows. And listen to the steady rhythm of the waves as they roll gently toward the shore beneath a sky full of stars. Let the world grow quiet. There's nowhere left to be. Nothing left to do. Only rest. Sleep now. You are safe. You are loved. You have been listening to Nicki Cozy Stories, created by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.